Back. We're looking at an unusual passage that I'm sure most of you have never heard before. Just kidding. So now it's the task of the preachers to find something new and different for us, or to make the text at least relevant for where we are in the time in which we live. That's what we really need to hear. The calling of Peter, James, and John. Jesus goes, and this is really interesting. You know, there's a call story in for most of the Gospels. But in Luke, this is chapter 5. There's already some stuff that's going on. Jesus has healed people, changed lives, touched people, all had a whole ministry going by himself. Those of you who feel like you're all by yourself once in a while, doing all the work that you can in the world, good news, Jesus felt the same way. And Jesus also called other people to help him. And Jesus also came down once he had started that. The guys that were fishing had been out all night long. You ever had days like this? Had been out working all night, all day long, and caught nothing. And still had to clean up. Felt like that before. And then this guy, Jesus, that maybe not they had ever heard about. I hope they had by that point. You know, he's kind of, word's getting around pretty good. There's a crowd pressing in around him. Somebody's heard about what he's been doing. And he gets into the boat and pushes out a little bit. And the funny thing is that, you know, when I'm tired and wore out and I feel like I've worked all day and I hadn't gotten anything for it, the last thing I want to do is to do just one more thing. You know? It's just one more thing. But Jesus asked them and they push out. Maybe if the very Son of God asked you to do something, that's a different indication other than just one more person coming through. But they push out and Jesus takes the seat. From what I understand, that typically in the Jewish tradition, the rabbi, the teacher would sit on the ground, would sit on a small stool, something, so that as the teach, it may be in the Catholic tradition, we have the ex cathedra, where the Pope, if he's sitting on the chair, makes a ruling or an edict. That's the teaching. Maybe perhaps that's some of that lineage back to where the sitting down. So Jesus went out onto the water and sat down in the boat and began to teach the people around him. You know, I always love how much they knew about, I guess is it physics that it would be, where they would, the voice would actually hit the water and reflect and go up into the people, they think. That's why he pushed out to sea a little bit. Amplify the noise. From American history, I always think this is always, George Whitefield one time was preaching in Philadelphia, the story goes, and Benjamin Franklin showed up. Have you heard this one? Some of you, I may have told it before. I love it. But anyway, he showed up, and Whitefield had this huge booming voice that could be heard. So Franklin, and you know how Franklin is, he wound up measuring off. He took steps, and he would walk over this way until he couldn't hear Whitefield anymore. And then he would walk this way until he couldn't hear Whitefield anymore. And so he wound up measuring the steps that he took. And so he calculated that George Whitefield could preach to 10,000 people if they were standing shoulder to shoulder with his booming voice. And in the midst of that, Franklin, since it's, Super Bowl Sunday, Franklin started putting in money because Whitefield was raising money for the orphanage in Georgia. And so Franklin said he put in some of his coins that he had, then he put in some of the larger coins that he had, and he finally emptied his wallet and he left before he had to go make a withdrawal from the bank. But Jesus was able to push out just a little bit and amplified his voice up into the crowd, and so people were able to hear. But the funny thing is, they don't even tell you what he said that day. Just totally gets discounted, thrown out of the text. We have important stuff to discuss, and that was not it, evidently. There are other opportunities for other stuff. But then he and Simon have this conversation in the boat. And he says, push out and drop your nets to the other side. And they threw out the nets of the boat. They would haul them back in. They'd work off the one side that had their dominant hand for strength. And Jesus is asking him, instead of using your strength to do what you're doing, why don't you push out just a little bit and use your other hand, the weaker hand, the less dominant hand. Some places in communion, they always say that the stronger hand receives the bread with the less dominant hand. I don't have to do that for my practice, but I think there's some strength to that we hold, but also Christ lifts us up and gives us the power that we need. But they're casting off the other side, the other side of the boat, the less dominant side of the boat, and they begin to pull in the fish, and there's so many fish that the nets begin to break. Yeah. They're breaking, they're pulling, they're splitting. They yell to shore, come, help us, let's get the rest of this in. The boats even begin to weigh down. And so the haul of fish was huge that day. And Peter was doing such a good job, he was ready to try it again tomorrow, I'm sure. He was a fisherman all of his life, and he wasn't doing very good the night before, but then he was. Well, I couldn't wait to do that again tomorrow too. I know what to do now. But Jesus says, no, instead of fishing for fish, you'll be fishing for men, for people. Sorry, that King James Version, you'll make you fishers of men, was ingrained. But in the Greek text, it means men and women. It's just the way it is. It means us all. Christ invites the disciples to fish for all people, not just for some. Jesus does that and invites the disciples to follow after him. After he had been healing and touching people's lives and changing their life, he said, hey, why don't y'all come and do this with me? Come, help me make a difference in other people's lives and the world around us. Maybe that's still what discipleship is these days for us. It's once again, here again, that invitation to follow after. One thing I thought with this text in reflecting and praying is that Jesus said, actually Simon responded back to Jesus, I will if you say so. I will if you ask me to. Sometimes in our world and in our 21st century lives, we're changing so much just to change for change's sake. We don't know why we're changing. Let's just change. We got to 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 change. Got to do something different. Anything. It doesn't matter what it is. We're just going to do something different. But why are the changes? Why are we asked to change? Why are the changes necessary? Why are they relative? What's so bad about what we've got going? Now, there's plenty in the world that ain't perfect. There's plenty of changes that need to be made. Let's do it kind of an analytical, methodical reason why, and part of overarching, especially for those of us who claim the name of Christ, let's change because it's God's way, God's calling, God's invitation, God's reasoning, understanding with God's heart. Let that speak to us as why my life needs to change, why something needs to be different. Not just change for change's sake, but to listen to where we're being directed and invited by God to change, to make a difference in the world. Every day, same old, same old. No, everything doesn't have to be the same old, same old. Every time we look at something is a constant change, evaluation, reflection, and seeing where and how we can better reflect God's presence in the world through our living and through our loving, through our giving, through all that we are. Christ continues, I believe, to invite all of us to follow after him. Even though it gets more and more difficult as days go on, we're still invited to follow after him because he's with us. That his presence and his mercy and his grace, that his love still is given to us and our invitation to respond to that. And that we go forth into the world unafraid, even into new waters and on the other side of the boats and all kinds of different stuff. But God's there. God's present. God will continue to care for us. and look after us and invite us to follow after him. And the world will continue to be changed and reflect God's kingdom every day, despite the forces of darkness around us. That we begin to see God's presence and God's light and love in all that we do and how we respond to God's goodness. So the invitation continues. Will you follow after me? All glory, honor, and power be to the one who was, who is,